Welcome to episode 158 of Silver Lining for Learning, Building Design Capacity for Online and Digital Education at Scale. My co-hosts are with me today, Punya Mishra from ASU, Yang Zhao from University of Kansas and the University of Melbourne, and Chris Deedy from Harvard is somewhere in the ether this week, and will catch back up with us the following week. We have guests in here from over the pond, and we have Margaret Korosec with us from University of Leeds, and she has her colleague Jeff Grabill from University of Leeds as well, formerly with Michigan State University, which is where Young and Punya are from as well. We have a lot of Michigan State former employees with us today. And Niels Floor is with us from Utrecht. I'm not sure if I got that right, Utrecht in the Netherlands. Margaret's going to introduce the other guests and herself, and then we'll go in and ask some questions. And so, Margaret, you want to take us off?
Thank you so much, Kurt. First of all, thanks as well for the invitation. This is really a great opportunity to join you all, so thank you for that. My name is Margaret Korosec. I'm the Dean of Online and Digital Education at the University of Leeds, and really happy to be here with you and happy to share the story that we've got going at Leeds. I report into Jeff Grabill. He's the Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Leeds for Student Education, leading on Curriculum Redefined, and he'll say a bit about that. And Niels Floor, and again, that's part of the story. Niels Floor is the Director for Learning Experience Design, his own company, and consulting on quite a unique way to design for an outstanding student experience.
And so, Jeff, Niels, would you, either one of you, like to jump in?
Jeff, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So let me pick the ball up that Margaret sat down. Talk a little bit. Let me actually go back to some work that we were doing at Michigan State my last few years around innovation in education. At starting to think about scale, but also starting to think about design very differently. And this is where we got to know Niels's work and why I was so excited that Margaret brought him to the University of Leeds to help us. And briefly, we started to, once we started to think about new kinds of learning experiences that were appropriate for the future of that particular university, we started to think about design at scale and started to think about design as a mechanism for facilitating change that was perhaps more appropriate for the cultures and practices of higher education. We can talk a little bit more about how difficult higher education is as a context for doing things. And stumbled upon Niels' work, started to think very differently about learning design, and started to think about the experience as the thing, if you will, that ought to be the center of learning design. And wrote a book, then leveraged some of Niels's work in the book that my colleagues and I wrote, called Designing for Change in Higher Education, that tried to draw some lessons from that work at Michigan State. So bring that forward. The reason I came to the University of Leeds was what I understood to be the boldest education strategy I'd seen in higher education, a real university-wide attempt to think about what kinds of educational experiences, what kinds of programs of study on campus, online, thinking about them holistically, were required to help this particular, world-class research university be useful for the future. And my understanding of the prior projects to scale to that point tended to be in the sciences only, tended to be in a finite area, or finite set of scientific disciplines. So nobody had attempted, and we certainly hadn't imagined it at Michigan State, educational transformation at scale, like we're trying to do it at the University of Leeds, which put even more pressure in my mind on design and learning experience design in particular as the spine, if you will, of that work. So let me stop there, and maybe I set Niels, maybe I set you up a little well to talk a little bit about your experience with learning design. But what we're trying to do at the University of Leeds really understands learning design at its core.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And well, let me go back a little bit. So I am a graphic designer / interaction designer / user experience designer by trade. And I ended up in higher education in the Netherlands as a part-time teacher. And when those two worlds kind of collided, I thought, well, what would happen if I would use my designer's perspective and my methods and tools and skills to kind of shape the way we learn. And since I was already designing user experiences, I thought, why not design experiences people learn from? And that's kind of how I started pioneering the field of learning experience design. And that's what I've been doing for the past 16 years. And what I really love about what I did in Leeds with these wonderful people is to apply these principles, these design principles, in a mixed group at a larger scale to really start building a community of practice, because learning experience design needs to be applied to be experienced, and that's what we've been doing with about 40 people there. And I'm really excited to see how it's going to pan out and how it's going to impact the organization and, most importantly, the students.
So Niels, I was at your website and piecing together pieces of your bio, and if people go to the blog post for this episode, they can read that. And the fact that you coined the term learning experience design, but you also say that you're on a mission. And your mission is to apply, develop, and promote learning experience design around the globe. What I'd like for us to do is go in reverse order, starting with Niels, and talk about what your mission is. So Niels, then Jeff, then Margaret.
Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to look at my work. It's kind of, I actually coined the term almost by accident, because I thought, well, if we design experiences people learn from, that will be called learning experience design, but it didn't exist at the time. So, I could register all the domain names and stuff like that. So there was nothing happening there. The reason I'm on this mission is because I believe that if you provide any person, any learner with a better experience to learn from, it's going to impact them personally, professionally, academically, but it's also going to benefit their organization, their company, their university, and the world around them. And when you really care about providing people with an experience, we all know how life-changing experiences can be, for better or for worse. You can learn a lot from our personal experiences and how they impact our lives. And my goal is to provide as many people as possible with impactful, transformative experiences. So that's kind of my mission.
Before we go to Jeff, do you realize that universities, at least here in the States, that teach in programs like Punya, I, and Young, and Chris are in instructional design or learning design technology, are now including courses in learning experience design? You've had an influence in at least at the graduate level, master's level. My students are graduating, they're saying, I have to teach learning experience design. We didn't have that at Indiana University. What's this all about? Have you noticed the impact? Is it just in the US, or have you seen it in other countries as well? Have people been contacting you and saying, hey, I've got to ramp up a new course or program and all this, and I could use some help?
Yeah, that's happened quite a few times. And I'm actually working with Tulane University right now to develop a program. And I've been in touch with different universities. One of the main challenges is that my views are maybe a bit more European in terms of where I come from. And I didn't even know about instructional design as a field until a number of years when I was already teaching learning experience design. So relating it to different fields, for the US, it's mostly instructional design related. For Europe, it's more experience design related. For other parts, it's more user experience design related. But there is a global impact that I noticed, and every time I see someone calling themselves learning experience designer, it's like awesome, especially since it took quite a few years for anyone to even take notice of the concept. And to illustrate kind of the weird way things went, I was expecting to do most of my work in the Netherlands and Europe, maybe Germany, France, Belgium. But my first trip went to Brazil, and then when I landed in Brazil, I got a call if I could come to Singapore, and then I went all over the place. So it's really, especially for the, let's say, between 2017 and 2020, until now. First, it was really like small pockets of people starting to experiment with learning experience design, being excited, calling me up, sending me a message, and from there it started to grow. And it's something that's it's not I may have coined the term. It's not mine, of course. It's something that's developing, and bringing in those different perspectives, having instructional designers in the US, having experience designers from Denmark, having user experience designers from Brazil, and service designers from Singapore, is all enriching this field. It's really interdisciplinary, and that's what I love about it. It keeps growing and developing, and I'm just really excited that people have really started to apply it.
The mission is going all around the world. That's great. Jeff?
Yeah, I think your question, Kurt, was about purpose, right?
Purpose, mission, yeah.
Yeah. So the purpose, our purpose at the University of Leeds with regard to education is to provide educational experiences and enable students and staff to thrive. And we've done a little bit of work to unpack what thriving means and what it looks like, particularly on the student side. And it's the things that I think we would all value about authenticity and engagement in the learning experience, opportunities to be creative, to be entrepreneurial, to make some mistakes, to learn from those mistakes. And so that's really what we're trying to do is design learning experiences that do enable people to thrive. And that is a different target than meeting maybe certain kinds of cognitive outcomes or certain kinds of learning outcomes, although we do that along the way. We really are trying to focus on the kinds of experiences in the classroom, outside of the classroom, that really do enable people to thrive. And Margaret's job is to, with the digital, the cross-cutting digital portfolio that she has for online and on campus, and particularly with online, is to figure out precisely what that means for our online learners, and how we leverage digital technologies for all of our learners to enable thrive. Right.
Sounds great, Margaret.
Yeah, no, that's a great segue as well then. Coming from a fully online space at Western Governors University in 2009, working in the early days there, part of that process was you are intentionally designing the student experience because it is fully online. You need to provide that experience for them, the navigation, the resources, everything that's part of that experience. And what I'm seeing now at Leeds is, what is transferable to that space for our campus experience as well, and where can that transfer over? But equally, what is a support model? Traditionally, let's say with online programs, you do have a team that is supporting. You do have learning designers. You do have someone developing or building within the virtual learning environment. For campus, you may not. And so that's, what does that look like if you have a team of learning technologists, for example, to support a campus experience? So one of the, ideas here with bringing in Niels and bringing in this cross-functional kind of cross-role team of 40 people is that group had, those who focused in learning design for online programs, as well as learning technologists for campus support, and academics teaching in that space, but also other roles, so academic development consultants and other types of roles. So I guess to answer your question, I am really passionate about bringing that knowledge and bringing that way of working to a wider audience, and to make that student experience as best as we can. But again, also building capacity within our teams to enable that, regardless of the different roles that we're looking at and that are available to support academic communities.
So Margaret, we did have folks from Western Governors University on previously, back on February 11th. If anyone wants to listen to the episode about learning experience design, we had Mark Miller on and Kim Round on. So you might, if you're a professor, you might want to sign this session along with that one as well. Yeah. And so I think we're going to Punya next. Punya's got a question and a comment.
Thank you. First, a comment. So Niels, it was very cool to hear about you're moving from design to education, because that's sort of my path as well. And often I describe myself as an educational designer rather than an educational researcher or a professor, because I think the field that we are in is one of design. This goes back to Simon's definition of design of going from existing to preferred states. That's what education is about. So I've always sort of seen myself as a designer in this space. So whether it's my teaching or whatever work I do, that's always with that lens. So I'll actually send you a link to a set of videos we just made recently. I think that will appeal to you because it's looking at design in education. So it's a framework for thinking, and this might be of interest to the others as well, which is thinking about design as working in 5 different spaces. So typically when we talk about design, you're talking about graphic design or product design or industrial design. So you're thinking of the artifacts that you're making. And so now you're talking about experiences. And so what we say in between the artifact and the experiences are processes. And that process design is a very important component of how we develop educational systems. Yeah. And then above and beyond the experience, we talk about systems and culture. And Jeff, at some point, I hope you'll talk a little bit about what it means to work in a higher ed environment, because what you're trying to do is actually shift systems and culture. It's not just changing people's mindsets, because people will come and go, the organization goes on, and the organization, what stays in an organization are the processes, systems, and culture that you have developed. So hopefully you get a chance to talk about that as well. But the question I had, and any each of you, whoever wants to step first can go in, but I would love to hear your perspective on this. It's one thing, as an instructor, as a teacher, I can go in and design a powerful learning experience for my students. I do that. That's my job. I think hard about it. Whether I succeed or fail, that's a different issue, but you're thinking about that. But when you're working at the level of a university, when you're working at that scale, so I want to unpack the scale sort of concept here, because you have everything from biochemistry to architecture to music to education to economics, to business. I mean, every discipline. I don't know how big Leeds is, but I'm assuming it's like a typical university and has all of these. Second, you have faculty whose job, for the most part, is doing research and writing, and that's what they're being evaluated, at least in the US system, as Jeff, you would know. And then, so teaching is not necessarily the biggest, most important thing for them. They're used to certain ways of doing this. So it's one thing to work at the level of individuals, working at the level of a department or program. It's one thing to work at the level of the university. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you are thinking of this idea of working at scale. What does that mean, and how is it reflected both in the in-person as well as the digital realms?
I mean, I'll just touch on some of that. I think I've got academic responsibility for the digital education service, and that's a service that includes the learning technologists that might support our campus programs, but also our dedicated teams, working with academic communities to design and develop fully online programs as well, which is also a portfolio we are growing. And part of the challenge in kind of the curriculum redefined was, how do we build capacity? How do we build in that support? How do we resource it? Where does that sit? What is the appetite for that support or resistance to that support? And so that's definitely been the journey I think we've been on for some time. And I think there's different approaches. And again, I think that's part of the scale answer, is that it's not a single solution. There are multiple approaches to making this work, multiple potentially teams or inroads into tapping into that support. And those are all becoming more mature now over the past year. So Leeds educator community, for example, a learning design agency that is kind of like a triage component, helping redirect academic teams to specialist professional services, and having dedicated support within your team. And also just planning, what does that look like? What's happening this coming academic year? What's happening in the next academic year? And having the, understanding what that scale looks like, so that that capacity can meet those, those kind of timeframes, because it will suddenly exponentially expand in 24, 25, and we're going to need to, have that ramping up over the next year to support those programs. So it's a multifaceted approach, I would say, and building capacity, resourcing it is also another key component there. But Jeff can definitely add more to that.
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly, and let's talk about the scale here, because in the scholarly literature on learning design, it often sort of touches on the constraint or the boundary or the fact that really we're not talking precisely about learning design in the course or module or curricular sense. We're talking about organizational change, and one of the reasons why we titled our book on Design for Change in Higher Education is we try to make those moves. The book is really a provocation. We don't have much sorted out in that book, but what we're explicit about is that design is a capacity that all higher education institutions ought to have, need to develop if they don't have it. And the focus of that design capacity is on the organization itself. So there really is no meaningful, sustainable curriculum change, programmatic change, learning design change at scale, unless the organization changes. So let me go into a couple of details about curriculum redefined to try to contextualize this a little bit. So one of the issues that Margaret just mentioned that we did at Michigan State and we're doing differently, but maybe more substantially at Leeds, is building some centralized enabling capacity that didn't exist prior. So think of the next generation of a Center for Teaching and Learning with a core design capacity and focus. That's one of the ways to imagine what that central capacity looks like. That doesn't capture the totality of it, but that's the closest analogy that most of our audience might understand. But the other bit that we're trying to do, that we have to do at Leeds is, our curriculum is a mess. It's a giant bowl of spaghetti. We have all sorts of systemic problems that not are just inefficiencies, they actually produce inequities in student outcomes. And so a part of the Curriculum Redefined project is what we think of as the rationalization project, which is sorting out some structural issues, some systemic issues in how we structure, architect the university, the experiences of staff and students, so that we make the institution operate fundamentally in a different way. So if I can use this metaphor, we're trying to rewrite the operating system of the institution with regard to how we educate. So that's a big chunk of work, and we can go into some of those details if you want. The other issue of scale is really what I think of as many-to-many kind of scaling. So at this point in Curriculum Redefined, it's not at the level of the academic experience at the department, the school, the program. Curriculum Redefined is about 40 projects right now. It's because the way in which psychology is doing this is different from the way English is doing it, which is different from the way, sociology is doing it. And that's a virtue, not a vice. Although I have to persuade some of my colleagues that it's a virtue and not a vice. They do tend to want templates and patterns that are applied, and that just doesn't work. People won't go with you on that journey if that's the way it works. So the way in which we're handling scale is working in two different ways. We're on this sort of central architecture. We're trying to solve problems for other people that make their lives easier. And then we're trying to support a really complicated design effort, which is many to many. There's about 40 different design projects, and that is exceptionally challenging. And we could spend all day on that, but I don't know. That's hopefully, Punya, that starts to get at how we're starting to address issues of scale, because they're non-trivial and they're very challenging.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm at ASU. I mean, you talk about scale, that's our DNA in some weird way. So I hear you completely. Niels, sorry.
Well, sorry, real quick, Punya, what I really like about Arizona State, I mean, so Leeds has 40,000 students. It's one of the biggest, most comprehensive universities in the UK. So, okay. But what I love about Arizona State in the Crow era is you all were designing for scale from minute one. If it doesn't scale, you don't do it. And right. That's it's an unusual way to think. Sorry, Niels, I didn't mean to step on you. Forgive me.
No problem at all. There's so many very interesting and meaningful things have already been said. And when I look at scale, for a university, the scale challenge is on the one side, as Jeff referred to, the architecture or the operating system that you're kind of rewriting or redesigning. But when you look at it from a perspective of a designer, I think one of the things Jeff touched upon when it comes to the purpose of what the university is doing is providing authentic learning experiences. And the design principles that you use as a learning experience designer always remain the same, no matter what the scale is. So the clients that I work for, I design very small, quickly designed learning experiences. I design large, complex, long-term experiences and anything in between. I think there are so many opportunities to when you have the capacity, when you have a group of people who are open and willing to try new approaches, and who are also aware of the fact that there are different approaches, and there is not one single correct one, that you can really look at, so what is the situation, what kind of approach would work best here, and then design for that specific situation. So the 40 different projects going on, I think, reflected really well that there is no single solution. You really can design in different ways. And I think by focusing on using your design skills to create authentic experiences, you can do that on a large scale or on a small scale. If you design with the right intentions, and you understand and empathize with the people that you design for, they will feel that no matter what the scale is. That's my experience.
Thank
So
you.
this is,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. This is quite fascinating. When Punya was asking about scale, Punya is our ultimate designer. So he talks about design. My interest is kind of slightly different. Our show started with COVID, and we have not touched on COVID, but digital and online really, was COVID's time. We had an interview with people from MIT, from Harvard, from Stanford. They produced, each of them produced a report about what COVID taught them, in this. So, but, I'm really trying to kind of bang my head against that wall right now, to thinking about the future of higher education. Before I die, I got to figure that out. So this has to do with higher education's future. So, Leeds, for example, was founded like in 1874, 150 years ago. So Leeds is Leeds. Now, when you are doing the online and digital, when you have a potentially globally distributed students, potentially globally distributed faculty, and so where does Leeds come from? One of the questions we ask, what makes Harvard Harvard? Do they have to go to Cambridge? Do they have to be there to enjoy a Harvard education? Or can Stanford deliver education that's called Stanford without going to California? So this is actually a real question, I think, to all of you, to Jeff, to Margaret, and Niels, is about what is the base? Can you have a University of Leeds degree without ever been to West Yorkshire? To say we've never been there. That's another thing. Of course, as a side note, Irene, a question to you is: now it looks like Jeff and Margaret and Niels, you guys are all from outside the UK. So you're from the US, you're from from the Netherlands. You try to teach the great empire how to design new education. How does that feel? And I'm just that goes to Punya's design with system and culture, right? When you go there, say, wow, who brought these people coming in to do this? So anyway, two questions. One was really the first thing about the space idea. How important is space? Where you are, history. The second one is really when you are given the job to lead a university that's a long time, 150 years, in the heart of England. And what are you, what an outside knowledge and expertise, how is that treated? So anyway, any one of you can get started.
I think Jeff should kick us off on this one.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. So it's interesting. There are quite a few outsiders at the University of Leeds right now, and there's a whole interesting cultural story about that. And I've been trying to learn about England and post-Brexit England and how it's struggling with being a post-empire. And that was a wicked question. So let me wind through it. It's a really great question. So let me start. I mean, I think the strategy the university leads right now is if I can steal a Crowism, right? One of the things that we're puzzling through is what does the next great British university look like? And I think higher education in the UK is struggling with that kind of a question without naming it quite in that way. There's a tremendous amount of identity crisis right now in the UK and in UK higher education about what is the role of education. So not too dissimilar from most countries I'm aware of, certainly not too dissimilar from the United States. So the United States is so fragmented and so distributed, there isn't really a coherent national conversation. So quickly, two things to sort of start and answer that question, and then I'll get out of the way and let Margaret and Niels take it on. One of the things we're thinking about at the University of Leeds is I do think the pandemic was a before and after moment. I do think we're different. Our students are certainly different. I don't think we understand it. And I think one of the things we're really trying to do is understand it. So I start there because one of the key issues we're thinking about as a design issue at the University of Leeds is student choice. Are students choosing to be in Leeds in West Yorkshire, beautiful city, fun city, to study, or are they choosing to study with us online from some other place in the world? That choice has to be explicit. We have to have conversations with our students about it, and the implications that choice has implications. And it's certainly, I'll let Margaret take the online bit, but what it's really forced for the first time in a long time on campus is a conversation about what does it mean to be on this campus in the city of Leeds for a few years to study. We're taking that very seriously as a design question and have kind of started over with physical estate, how we're thinking about all kinds of formal and informal learning spaces, public spaces. So we're starting to think very carefully around location and choice as really key design drivers. So I'm going to get out of the way at that point in time. There's all sorts of implications of this, particularly around our relationship with the global South and other parts of the planet for research and education. But let me get out of the way. I don't know, Margaret, if you wanted to take up the mantle at that point or not.
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of things, and again, it was a great question and several things to unpick in there. I think one, Leeds has invested for a long time in digital education, actually. So was actually quite well suited and situated to transition during the lockdown and supporting students with, an existing infrastructure, existing support. And so that, that transition, I think certainly it was challenging for everyone, no question, but there was, existing support models that made that a little bit easier, I would say, as compared to maybe other institutions that didn't have that central type of core support from a digital education perspective. So that's one. And in regard to place and space, it's a great question as well. I mean, one, I think Leeds has always fostered international collaboration, partners, many different in different subject areas and across the board. I think that's been a really strong point to be a global leader in higher education, but also, have that radical collaboration. Our own Vice Chancellor will talk about, radical collaboration and what does that look like? And actually, it's kind of like, it's having these kind of conversations, being really transparent about what we are doing, being clear that that's what's happening, but also, in our offer, we are growing. Have a very small, fully online offer at the moment, actually growing that significantly over the next decade. And that is about choice. It is about choice. It's about giving options to be a member of the University of Leeds. We put a lot of effort and research into what does it mean to have a sense of belonging and in our student experience and in our design of our programs. And so that sense of belonging actually is a common thread that we embed in across our programs and in the nature of our offer, extended offer, of our services available to students. And so that's something that, how do we do that in an online space? How do we make sure it's part of that experience, regardless of how students are coming to Leeds? And part of it also is, recognizing that someone may come for an online experience, they may come to campus, it may be vice versa. They may start small and go to a program. They may, return to us. In fact, just yesterday, on Friday, we celebrated a virtual celebration of our online graduates. And one person had finished his undergraduate degree in 1999 at the University of Leeds on campus. He just finished his master's in engineering management, a fully online program, quite a few years later. And so you think, wow, that's amazing, right? Complete career transition. But that's the story, actually. That is the story. And it's happening, I think. So that sense of place is becoming less, fewer borders in that space, in the digital and physical space.
So Niels, before you jump in, I just want, because what I've been thinking a lot about is religion. The Catholic Church has so many, churches around the world globally. And in terms of their experience design, well, Niels, that comes to you, right? So what's the experience designed in the various churches? And of course, and everybody wants to go to Vatican, but then you have other churches. So if you think about Leeds, what's the Leeds online experience? Because, Margaret, when you were at Western Governors, it never had a place anywhere, right? I mean, it never truly had a campus. Plus, you guys were in Salt Lake City. What's another church place? So I'm just thinking about all this massive things about churches are very interesting. Before technology was distributed globally, right? And then how do you, and is that experience really kind of global? And I love what Jeff said about choice, is that, so if everybody is offering online, I'm just thinking about in the future, and in 20 years, especially Jeff's mentioned about Global South, I'm very concerned about, that population. So how do you reach a lot of people cheaper, but give them a solid experience? What's the difference between a Leeds experience versus let's say an Edinburgh experience online, right? So if you go to the city, it will definitely be different. But what is a psychology degree from Leeds versus Edinburgh or Cambridge or any of the other UK? Another thing, Jeff, you just, I'm glad an American is helping the British trying to rebuild their, the great university of the United Kingdom. But Rin, it's just really interesting. So Niels, when you're thinking about design learning experience, and is the church experience in each classroom the same, or how would you do that? Because again, remember, we have to remember we are working with professors who are probably the stubbornest, the hardest to change. You guys know that, because I never changed in my life. I was, So anyway, so Niels, go ahead.
Wow. Well, I think the Catholic Church are great at providing an experience, thinking about, building high up. You have to look up to the sky. There's a lot of pictures. So it's really well thought out as, to relate to that point. But when I go to a place to give a lecture or to train people, I do my research because I understand that the University of Leeds is different than the University of Amsterdam or the University of Edinburgh. And let me say something that might sound controversial, but in my opinion, there are no digital learning experiences. It's all people being somewhere, and the medium might be digital that they interact with each other, but it's still people. And when I design a learning experience, when I look at the environment, the place where people learn, I look at 4 factors, which is what's the physical environment that they are in, what kind of stuff, like is it at home and behind a desk, or is it at the university? What kind of virtual environment do they learn in, which can be an online learning system? And then there's the social and cultural aspects. And I think that it doesn't really matter where you are, that it's really important to in your design strategy to think about, so what makes Leeds Leeds? There are some traditions there, there's a lot of expertise, and that's something that is also changing, of course. So it's not something that's set in stone, but there are some values and some concepts that are really important to every individual university. And I think you can design for that by really carefully looking at the social cultural environment, by looking at how do people interact with their environment and how do people interact with each other within that environment. And I asked the 40 participants of the training that my team and I provided, what made your student experience great, going back to their own student experience. And the answers have very little to do with technology. They have everything to do with people. And there's a broad scope of answers, but those answers are quite universal and also quite timeless, if you will. So I think you can, going back to the concept of designing authentic experiences, you have to design with the right intentions and think about what's important to us as a university and how does it translate to any experience that we provide. And for me, there is no real difference between whether it's online or offline. You design with the same goal in mind, and yeah, so that's what I try to look at, and not necessarily look at is it online or offline, is it on campus or off campus, but really look at it from a human-centered perspective. Who are the people that I'm designing for? Where are they, and how can I reach them, and how can I get my message across?
Okay, we've got a question in our YouTube channel, and Punya is going to ask a couple. This from Gerald, and then I'll come back and ask a question of you. So Punya.
Sure, thank you. So quick comment, Niels, when you're speaking, I was reminded of there's this amazing documentary by Jonathan Miller called The Body in Question, which is about the human body and medicine and so on. But here's this amazing clip where he's, I don't remember, somewhere in France in some historical spot, and he's watching these water fountains. And he shows these videos of these little water fountains. And what you see is that each one of them has a different quote unquote personality. And at some level, you think like, what can a water fountain's personality be? But once you watch it, you see that. And I think what is so beautiful and ineffable about design in some way is that you're trying to capture something which is an ongoing, evolving process, yet maintaining its identity at the same time. And, I think that's, I think, Jeff, maybe the biggest challenge that you face in some way is what is it? And I think Zhao's sort of trying to get at that, his question, which is like, how do you maintain an essence when things keep changing? And I think that goes to values, that goes to a whole range of complicated issues, which again, I don't think we have the time to dive into, but thank you for sort of sparking that memory and recollection in my head. But I'm going to ask the question that Gerald Fussell, who's joining us from Canada, a regular viewer, his question was, how would you measure the success of your work? And I'm going to go with Niels first, Margaret, then Jeff, because that's sort of going in scale, I think, from the experience to the bigger institutional issue. Experience, digital, institutional. So Niels, go ahead first.
For me, it's quite impossible to answer because it really depends on the type of experience that you design. And like I just said, the clients that I work for are so diverse that sometimes you are trying to achieve goals that you're not able to measure, that are things that are happening inside people that cannot be externalized or made tangible. So when I design a learning experience, when I formulate the learning outcome, which isn't just about checking learning objectives to get to the outcome, as Jeff also referred to, not just cognitive outcomes, but really the whole experience. What do people gain from it from a broader perspective? If you know what you're aiming for, you have to kind of, along the way with your design process, design the measurement for that, because often there is no standard measurement for what we do, because you're creating new experiences, so it's never been done before, so you have to kind of figure it out along the way. But what I've learned is that, and that's also been kind of proven in my work scientifically, that when you have a solid design process in place and you really do your work, you do your research, you design, you iterate, you co-create, you invite the learner, and you build upon that. If you design with a solid design process and with good design skills, generally you get where you want to be. And so we've designed learning experiences where after designing them, putting them into practice, we've had someone kind of test them scientifically whether or not they worked, and they worked, which we couldn't assure because, I'm not a scientist, I'm a designer, but it did turn out to work. And I have a lot of faith in the design process. If that's done correctly, 9 out of 10 times you will get very close to where you want to be, or often further than you want to be, go beyond expectation even.
Yeah, it's great points, Neil. I think I think we can always be a bit better about how are we measuring. I think that's part of the challenge in a way. There's the standard, let's say, ways to measure of end of unit feedback and things like that. That doesn't really capture, though, this experience. And I know Niels with the workshop there, part of the design experience was that emotional connection, with the learners, with the students, between academics and students as well, is like, it lands in a different way if you have that kind of emotional connection with what you're learning. And that's a challenging one to measure. So I think we're getting better at that. There are different ways of doing that, again, in an online space as compared to what that might look like in a campus. But I think those lines are blurring a little bit as well. How can we design that in? I think there's also part of the culture change that we're looking at as well is being curious and being experimenting a little bit. What does an intervention look like, and doing it a little bit, not a year in advance or not planning for next year's iteration, but like, what does it mean to do something right now and look at the impact? How does that differ from that activity done slightly differently? And so, having that curiosity and slight openness, I guess, to doing that and looking at different ways of measuring is part of the change process, I think, that we're looking at. But where does the technology and the digital infrastructure support that, capture that from an impact perspective? So it's definitely a journey. I wouldn't say that we're fully there yet.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, measurement. So let me come at it from three different perspectives. Certainly, in what I alluded to earlier as the rationalization part of the Curriculum Redefined project, we certainly have some objectives about some time savings, about some cost savings. We're over educating, if we can say that, and so there's certain things that we have as targets to measure that we think will enable staff and students to thrive as an outcome. So we can certainly measure those things. Our assessment strategy, to give you an example, is really focused on less summative assessment and more formative assessment. And so these are things we can track and pay attention to. But then when we get into this characteristic of, is a program transformed? And we have some design guides for what we want the outcomes of a lead student experience to be. And this is the way, we didn't really answer your question about what is distinctive about the University of Leeds, because we don't precisely have an answer to that question yet. It's a fantastic question, but we do have some design frameworks and heuristics that are intended to help us come up with what does it really mean to have a Leeds education and to learn at the University of Leeds. So we'll be able to put some of these transformed programs in relationship to those expectations and make some judgments about whether these programs of study are truly transformed or not. But let me end there. That's a really interesting question that we're grappling with. So if we have 40-ish Curriculum Redefined projects right now operating in 40 different schools at the University of Leeds, what does transformed look like? And who gets to make that decision? That's the conversation that's the fuzziest and to my mind, genuinely the most interesting conversation we're having right now. So I don't want to close that down too quickly because it's too important.
And something, I mean, if I would phrase that question, I wouldn't have asked it in terms of measure. I would have asked it in terms of how do you know that you're being successful, or how do you know that you're on the right path, right? Because measure for some of these things, they don't. In fact, are not just crude in their, approach, but also sometimes mislead, because then you start trying to meet the metrics rather than what the original intention is. Then Zhao's written a lot about that, so I won't, but pass it on to you, Kurt, for your question.
Yeah, so, when we design these shows, we're often, reading different sources and saying, wow, we want to bring so-and-so on this. It's really enlightening and so forth. So about a week ago or a week and a half ago, I was reading about the speakers for Online EDUCA Berlin. And if you have never heard of Online EDUCA Berlin, it's definitely a conference you might want to consider. It's probably the largest online learning conference in the world. It used to be half corporate, half higher ed, and a mixing of other nonprofit and K-12. Yes, fascinating conversations are taking place at that. I keynoted 20 years ago or so. Came out dressed as a monk or something, predicting the future or something like that. And they never invited me back for whatever reason. I think I analyzed my data on the plane on the way to Berlin. Anyways, the article that Margaret was interviewed about is called Creating an Ecosystem of Design. Or I think she wrote this article, Creating an Ecosystem of Design, and she goes through 4 assumptions. Institutions don't need to invest in specialist design support is number 1. Assumption number 2, academic staff can adjust their academic practice on demand. Assumption number 3, templates solve all design questions. And assumption 4, design is just for students. So I recommend that you read this. This came out June 13th. It's linked to the blog post. And so I'd like to, it's 2-part question. I'd like to have Margaret start, and if Jeff and Niels would like to add too. In this reflection, she talks about the need to establish an ecosystem of design within higher education institutions. So we've talked about that throughout the hour, creating this ecosystem. But what haven't we talked about in terms of creating an ecosystem and the media design support teams and so forth? What have we left out? People might want to, when they're listening to the show, might be thinking about doing that. The second part of that question is, this title of this show originally included something called intentional design. That's been deleted from the title, but I think it's still important to Margaret. It might be important to Jeff and Niels as well. You mentioned in there templates don't solve all design questions, but templates can be intentionally designed. So you want to talk a little bit about intentional design and go back to Jeff talked about templates briefly earlier. You want to elaborate on that, Margaret?
No, thank you so much, Kurt, for the opportunity. I really appreciate that. And
congrats on being invited to be a keynote speaker on
thank you.
Berlin. That's like a cherry on a career. That's really great.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been going there for 10 years or so, so it does feel quite exciting to do that. So I'm excited about that.
Registration paid free, right?
I know, it's amazing. It's brilliant. So, but yeah, this is really. I am really passionate about this space. And I think just to one of your earlier questions about what haven't we talked about, we talk about academic practice as well in this. What does that mean for academic community and their experience? And certainly in the online space, it's, how do we, what is online academic practice and how do we support that? But again, that transferability to our campus community and our campus student experience. We talk about the student experience, but equally, where is the academic experience in that? And how are we supporting both experiences, if you will, in that space? And probably the templates touch on that because, you're essentially, a template is, let's say, intentional to guide, what type of activity could there be, what kind of, what's the activity design in this space? But also, if you think about it, what does that mean then to invest that time before the program is live? What does that mean though, once the program is live, and how can that design support the actual on program, when the program is live? What does that look like? And again, that's regardless of whether it's online or on campus. And I think that's a key part that in a way is different, because campus experiences, they maybe didn't always have that support. They were fully responsible, academic community were fully responsible for their the way they taught their program on campus. So introducing that design element and introducing what that might mean to invest time ahead of the launch of that program, and what does that then mean, for their teaching experience once the students are in the classroom, whether it's virtual or on campus. So there is something there that is quite powerful, and in what that support looks like, but also what that academic experience is, and what that means to invest that time ahead of time, and what support then is useful to make that transition. I think that's definitely something that I'm really quite aware of, but that's part of that link to that ecosystem. How do we create that culture? It goes back to the culture, it goes back to the support models.
You want to
Thanks,
talk
Kurt.
about the template aspect, the second part of the question, and intentional design, or did you already cover that?
No, I think I kind of covered it. I think that again, templates can serve to help frame what that experience might be. But again, it shouldn't be limiting, but there's also that, it's about how are we framing these things? How are you diversifying your resources? How are you diversifying the types of activities that you are introducing? That I think is where it's the prompts. If you think about a template being kind of a set of prompts, what am I thinking about when I'm thinking ahead about what my students are going to experience, or how I as an academic am going to be providing resources or projects or assessment? And those prompts, I think, is the intentionality there behind that. What does that mean? How am I reflecting on my own practice, and how am I reaching those students?
Good. Niels or Jeff, who would like to jump in?
Go ahead, Niels.
You're muted, Niels.
Yeah, I always forget. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it really ties in nicely with what Margaret just said about the question, what didn't we really cover yet? As a designer, I want to get as close to the learner as possible without sounding creepy. But because that's the only way for me to, to be able to understand who I design for, and that defines the quality of my work. It's not just a design; it's designed specifically for a person or a group of people. And the traditions in universities and there's a long tradition within European universities in general. And something that I've seen with Dutch universities as well is how do you close the gap between the educator or the professor and the student, in the sense that if they are asked to put on this design hat and think about, well, I want to empathize with my student, I want to be able to offer them an experience that's really personal to them, that works for them, that is a big ask. That's quite a challenge. So I think that's one of the things that I often run into, that if there is an unwillingness to change in terms of, because you have to really be vulnerable to the students, say, well, I'm going to listen to you to determine what I'm going to do. And that's not the way it went for centuries, basically. So I think that's an interesting part of the discussion about how to implement a different design approach within the university, closing the gap between the educators and the student in a way that works well for all of them.
Yeah, so I'll pick up what we didn't talk about, but Punya mentioned it earlier, and we've worked with about ecosystems and culture of design in higher education. We've worked with a number of designers who worked in other contexts, and they find higher education the most difficult place to do design work that they've ever worked, and there's irony there, because we have all of the things we need to do to all of the elements of compelling learning experience design are all right there, right? We have it's all there on a campus, and but academics are exceptionally difficult to work with. Jean mentioned that earlier. I'm just as difficult as he was in his career, I'm sure, to work with. We're prone to solutionism. The tolerances for the kind of vulnerability and play that is sometimes required to do really good design work, our tolerances are very low. But I think culturally, the thing that is often missing is intention. And I want to locate that in leadership. And It takes exceptionally strong university leadership for a design culture and a design ecosystem to exist at all, let alone flourish. And we forget that all the time, I think, in terms of how we talk inside higher education about design cultures. So we really need probably a new generation of academic leaders who have a sense of purpose and coherence about what it means to be a university, and are willing to invest the resources into the kinds of design conversations that will help universities get around some really difficult corners that we all need to get around. So it's that kind of leadership intentionality that I think is the thing we didn't talk about that is key to culture.
I have to unmute here. It's been a wonderful hour show, and I appreciate Margaret bringing Niels and Jeff in, and we had a great conversation. Margaret, do you have a 15, 30-second final comment before I introduce the next show?
Well, first, I think this is an important conversation. So just grateful for the chance to share, a bit of a story at Leeds, how we've approached our challenge of scaling and how we're improving the student experience, regardless around the world where those students might be.
Thank you. I will introduce the next show. Episode 159 will be at 11 a.m. Eastern, like this show was. The title is 21st Century Language Learning, a chat with YouTuber polyglots who know over a dozen languages each. We'll have Lucas Spaghetti and Fabricio Carraro, who are both Brazilian. And this is a trend today, is YouTubers teaching languages online. And we'll talk a bit about ChatGPT and the teaching of language learning. It's my research area. And actually, we'll get a story on how they interviewed Barack Obama about generative AI with generative AI. So come listen.